You know, back when I was in the academy, we would follow every toast with a song.
So, hi everyone, welcome to Where No Bubs Has Gone Before, a Star Trek The Next Generation podcast exploring all 7 seasons of Star Trek The Next Generation from its characters, themes, and episodes. This is hosted by myself, Jay Record, and my father, Jake Record, for the benefit of Jake's grandson and my son, Ben the Bear. We will be, of course, releasing this podcast to YouTube because we understand there's a lot of Star Trek fans out there. How are you doing today, Jake?
I'm good, Jay.
Great. So today we are looking at Star Trek The Next Generation Season 1, Episode 16, When the Bough Breaks, which debuted February 15th, 1988. And this is actually a very interesting episode because it deals with something we've been talking about a few times in previous episodes, family life aboard a starship within the Star Trek universe.
Yes.
So, just to kind of open up, let's give the listeners at home kind of a rundown about where we're going.
Sure. Yes.
Conversation. So, Commander Riker. The show opens up with Commander Riker walking down a corridor with Captain Picard, with orders for them to go up to the bridge. As they continue down the corridor, a young boy named Harry is running away from his father and runs directly into Will Riker. Will helps him up. It turns out Harry was running away because he refuses to study calculus any longer. Calculus being a thing young boys learn. Riker witnesses a confrontation between the son and the boy's father before walking away to the turbolift to take him to the bridge. When they get up to the bridge, Picard informs Riker that the crew have investigated a faint energy reading coming from the nearby Epsilon Mino system. Upon hearing the name from the system, Riker knows why Picard has called him to the bridge. The system is apparently home to the legendary mythical world of Aldea, which Riker compares favorably to Atlantis from our Earth history, and a Neiman of Xerxes 7. Lieutenant Yar kind of probes Riker for a little bit, and Riker explains that the inhabitants of Aldea were thought to have the ability to cloak their planet in darkness to hide from marauders and hostiles that pass by. All of a sudden, the crew of the USS Enterprise are witness to the revealing of the legendary planet of Aldea. So that's where we are with this episode. We're dealing with, on one hand, children, because what will be revealed is that the Aldeans are looking for a fresh batch of children to replenish their local population. And we're also going to be dealing with a world of legend, which I actually think is fairly interesting when in a science fiction setting. It's kind of bringing the fantastical back into a world that is supposed to be, kind of built on the idea of reason and logic winning the day. I just wanted to start by asking, what do you think of the episode, Dad?
I think it's like a lot of the episodes we've reviewed during this first season. The rap from fandom has been that it wasn't that good of a season, but some of the stories, this one, the last one, the stories have been very well put together and constructed very well.
Mm-hmm. There is,
and there was a lot. If you really think about the episodes, there are a lot of in-depth issues, in-depth points that are presented.
It actually makes me kind of. I think there's a storytelling in the 80s and in the 70s and 80s especially, um, that is kind of missing from the 90s and early aughts, and especially missing now from, um, I think, storytelling in terms of carrying a real substance and weight between being able to portray a relatively simple narrative. I think one of the strengths Star Trek has is that it can portray very simple science fiction narratives, but in that simple narrative carry a lot of like weight and substance behind it philosophically or ethically or
Yes,
exploring something scientifically.
right.
Um, I am one thing that I'm coming away with as we watch this first season and review it together is how prescient in the late 80s so many issues were to today, and how a lot of the things that they're talking about set in the supposed 24th century are things that we're dealing with right now in the 21st.
Hmm.
And and in some ways I think the show has already answered the charge that Q gave them in Encounter at Farpoint. Like
Hmm.
they've already proved that they've evolved to a certain extent. Um, the question is, do we have the capacity as the viewers to evolve now? Because I
Mm-hmm.
think the stories are getting a little bit more science fictiony, and I think they're getting a little bit more esoteric than they are connected to like real world things that were going on at the time. Though there is a discussion about AI we can have in here about this episode.
Well, you bring up some good points because one of the things I just thought of is that when Harry was complaining that he didn't want to take calculus, he
Oh yeah.
appears to be like 8 to 9, maybe 10 years old. And I think something we've talked about before is, if you, from what I understand of the mathematics that people in grade school are being taught, it is much more advanced than what I was taught when I was in
Mm-hmm.
grade school from what 1957 through 1962 or something like 1963, something like that.
Oh, you and I wouldn't be able to recognize the math system they're teaching now because they're teaching Common Core.
Yeah, I understand that too.
Yeah.
Yes. So that was a whole interesting, sort of projection forward, is that the need to advance the complexity and perhaps even the volume of information that young children were exposed to in their early education has got to the point where instead of calculus being something that gets into high school like it does now, it's something that's at the grade school level. So I think it turned out to be an interesting thing.
May I make a comment on that for a second?
Sure.
We often employ the idea of social Darwinism in a negative context that,
Hmm.
we apply it to stupid people doing stupid things. But I think in terms of looking at evolution from a positive standpoint, I think the fact that children now are learning higher mathematics younger and younger speaks to not only probably more and more of the previous generations learning these higher mathematics, but I think there's kind of an evolution taking place kind of on a small, kind of really low level that we don't see, but children are able to adapt to higher level functions and thinking and intelligence and skills than we were maybe in the past.
Hmm.
And I think a lot of that has to do with the intersection of technology.
Hmm.
A lot of it has to do with the fact that I think our educational methods are better despite the fact that we're still having issues in terms of testing the quality of our education.
Hmm.
I think a lot of it too is that kids have access to information and are able to somewhat self teach themselves now. There are a lot of people that are actually learning mathematics online and doing very well through that. So,
Mm-hmm.
I think there's a lot of different things that are happening that are allowing this to take place. So in the future, um, Harry might be an actual social outlier by the fact that he doesn't want to learn calculus. Maybe not learning calculus is like not wanting to learn, simple addition.
Well, one of the things that happened in this episode early on, when the Aldeans revealed themselves, they did this heavy duty scan of the ship,
Mm-hmm.
and they really concentrated on all the children.
Mm-hmm.
And perhaps what was done during that scanning is to figure out, what, based on brain chemistry, brain patterns, or something, what the interest of the children are. Because when the several children came down, particularly there was the little girl that was interested in music and had musical talent, and they attached her to a family that could nurture her in her musical skills and so forth. Harry, one of the reasons that it comes forth that he didn't want to study calculus is that he really was interested in art. The Aldeans put him with a couple who were going to nurture him in the art. Um,
Mm-hmm.
they gave him this some sort of like laser sculpting tool, which
Yes, that
was
was very cool.
the again, the higher technology issue came into it. And one of the comments that I made is, um, gets into some of the educational considerations that we have in this country now is, how do we, you know, change education so that it is perhaps more specific to an interest of an individual young
Mm-hmm.
person. I made a comment that I think that it still exists in Germany, perhaps in other European countries, that they use testing to help guide students into their career pathway. So that if someone really doesn't want to go the STEM route, which,
Mm-hmm.
like in this country right now, everybody should be STEM, which it really isn't the case. In Germany, they say, look, you have good skills, mechanical skills, so you should go to
Mm-hmm.
a trade school. And, there are good jobs in Germany in engineering and manufacturing and so forth. The Germans are known for quality and so forth. So the little that I know about their system, it tries to, you know, give constructive counseling to students as to, what they should do in the future as adults to earn an income, to contribute to society. And, I think there's some discussion in this country about that right now, the push has been, well, everybody needs to go to college. Well, some of the discussion is, well, maybe not everyone needs to go to college. Um, if they really don't have an interest in that area. But then, what is the avenue for directing individuals who really don't want to go to the college, or, don't test well, so that they go into some sort of, um, apprenticeship or training so that they can find a well paying job.
May I rebut with something from this actual episode?
Yeah, sure.
So, like, I think if we were recording this podcast, 10 years ago, everything that you just said would be absolutely correct. I think the one thing that we hadn't guessed, and it ties directly into when the bow breaks, is the coming intercession of AI and how that really is going to affect not only things in the education market, but in terms of the labor markets. It's going to change the way that we manage supply chains, how we handle medicine. Um, AI's application is going to be far reaching, and I don't like using the word. Well, do you know what? Apocalyptic and revolutionary are two good words that you can kind of exchange in there, because in some ways AI is really going to bring the downfall of some things, and including human labor. And I don't know if you've watched The Expanse, but like AI has become such a huge thing there that Earth has such a hard time creating jobs for people that most of the population is on basic assistance. Um, I think that we're heading towards that, and I think that's why you're now seeing the ideas of certain candidates, like here in New York, Andrew Yang is running for mayor, and Andrew Yang's big policy point is a universal basic income,
Hmm.
um, which for New Yorkers in the middle of the coronavirus will be a huge benefit. But the question
Hmm.
is about its long-term viability on a national scale. Um,
Well, this also fits into something. We talked about this, I think, the last podcast. I heard a radio program today about how Spain has really decided to go
yes.
nationally with the 4-day week.
Mm-hmm.
And there were some places they experimented with it, and people felt that. Matter of fact, the example was given a restaurant um, that they were going to only be open, 4 days a week, that they were going to work a lot harder and have longer hours on those days that they worked. And they thought that would be stressful and they wouldn't see their family during those days. And it turned out, as I understood, that it was very manageable,
Mm-hmm.
and it was different. But um, the 3-day week gave them a lot more time off with
Mm-hmm.
their family and to enjoy things and that sort of thing. And it sort of fits in with that. And yeah, I mean, one of the things I was thinking of too is that a lot of these episodes, um, as we've been discussing, the use of computers and um, advanced technology, holograms, the holodeck, and so
Mm-hmm.
forth. You know, these are things when these shows were written back in 1980s. I think the viewers had a very limited practical understanding of what computers could do because we
Mm-hmm.
were still in the early stages. It was pre-internet and so forth. And now when you and I look at these episodes from the late 1980s, we sort of have a prejudiced view because we have more practical experience of what computers and information technology has meant to us and have a better sense of where it is going, which fits in with your very good comment about AI and how that's going to, already starting to change the economy.
Well, one thing that AI is going to do is remove, you know, the primary function of technology is to create tools that reduce human labor. Like, that's the technical definition of it, that's the legal definition of it, that's the ontological definition of technology. It These things are created to reduce human labor first and foremost. Computers are at the forefront of that.
Well, and that goes back to the invention of the wheel.
Well, I bring this up because it becomes a question of what is the purpose of our education systems.
Hmm.
Because in the present day, a lot of our education systems are geared towards training people towards the idea that one day they're going to enter the workforce and have to create their own economic means in terms of providing their own shelter, their own food, supporting a family, all the normal things that we find in our Western capitalist economy. Um, I think the problem with AI, and you see it here with the Aldeans, is that the custodian can do everything for them.
You might explain just for those listening what the custodian is and
So
kind of what it means.
so after the Aldeans scan the Enterprise, they kidnap I think they kidnap somewhere in the area of 8 or 9 children.
Yes, so, yeah, might even not be that
We,
many.
well,
Yeah,
we don't even meet all the kids.
right.
Um, but they kidnap a handful of children with the idea that they're going to parent them, and these children will procreate a new generation of Aldeans. Because what we've discovered in the episode is that the Aldeans have lost the ability to procreate. For some reason, they're suffering some sort of genetic mutation or disorder, degeneration, that has robbed them of the ability to reproduce and bear children. Um, one of the children kidnapped is Wesley Crusher because, of course, he's a genius and is immediately scanned during the scanning phase of the episode, and is deemed to be a leader among the children. So when he is brought down, he is brought in front of this gigantic kind of, well, it's a room, and it has several panels in it, but it has one central panel, and it seems to be hooked up to this artificial intelligence called the custodian, which, when explained to Wesley, essentially controls everything. But there is a lack of knowledge on the side of the Eldians when it comes to real technical things like, um, is this thing functioning properly? If it is malfunctioning, how do you know? How do you fix it? How is this thing powered? The Aldeans seem to have lost that sort of knowledge because they've come to rely on this AI, exclusively for their means. Uh, so the custodian is basically artificial general intelligence, which is a big term for a bunch of things and a bunch of theories. And I read a lot about AI, but I'm not going to claim, of course, to be any sort of expert. But essentially, what happens is, um, and you made a note of it in the notes that you sent. The Aldeans have they basically have a no need economy where they don't have to actually do any work to provide for themselves their material means.
One of the parts of the legend that Riker explained is that the way they've created this paradise is
Right.
that they have taken care of all of their needs, basic needs, and so forth. It's kind of like Andrew Yang had been there uh, centuries ago and set up, you know,
Oh, apparently
guaranteed.
their culture's been around for millennia.
Yeah, that
Yeah.
they've had universal basic income for thousands of years, so they can devote themselves to the arts and
Mm-hmm.
music and poetry, and that's why they focus on you know finding those children that have talents in those areas and uh, uh, so on.
So, one thing that AI is projected to do is reduce the labor market. So, if you reduce the labor market, the question becomes, what do you educate your children towards? What we know now about education is that children actually benefit from more time in school, not less time.
Mhm.
So, European children actually go to school longer than American children do. They just have a different set of breaks, than we do. We have a longer period in the summer, but from what research is telling us, that 3 to 3.5 months off in the summer is actually detrimental to a child's learning.
Doesn't the fact that we have summer vacation is a kickback to our agrarian time also?
A little bit, yeah.
Hmm.
So, like, there's a lot of applications, to summer vacation that don't actually fit our modern day
Right.
living. But anyway, if AI were to come about, taking out the labor thing, there's an argument that children would be allowed to pursue a more qualitative and more, just a far better and more immersive education, and that seems to be what the Aldeans have achieved here. Um, the one thing I do note, and I always find this interesting in science fiction, there's always these ideas of mythical and perfected societies that have somehow achieved this level of evolution through their technological progress or their philosophical progress. But to me, there's always a problem because it seems like they relegate themselves to a caste system. Like Wesley Crusher is casted into being a leader. Harry is casted into being an artist, even though he doesn't even know he has any skill at art.
Mhm.
Um, I forget the little girl's name, but she's cast
As a musician,
as a
yeah.
musician because she has an interest in music, and she's paired with one of the best musicians. Um, Alexander, I think, is basically kidnapped in Shanghai to be a personal little girl
Rochella,
for
yeah.
Rochella.
As it turns out, yeah.
But like they don't really define what Rochella does. So, but my point being, like, there's always this kind of weird caste system being set up to where like people are designated to very set narrowly defined roles. And I always just find that interesting. It's just a little aside I wanted to throw in there.
Sure.
Um,
Sure.
But kind of getting back to, the dependence on, having a no-need economy, but then having too much dependence on the custodian. And Wesley commenting that all computers require maintenance. You made a note about, did the Alteans' technological sophistication or their pride in it, along with isolation, deprive the Aldeans to different ideas? I.e., if they're so advanced, why didn't they figure out the reason for their inability to reproduce, which Dr. Crusher later discovers is created by the radiation generated, I think, by the shield.
Yeah, what happened was that since the Aldeans had created this shield, which was basically a planetary-sized cloaking device,
Right, it
that
thinned their ozone layer.
it thinned their ozone layer, so there's enough, ultraviolet or sun radiation coming from their sun, their star, that was, causing damage to their genetics structure, so that they couldn't reproduce for that reason. And since they became so dependent on the custodian, um, it was like there were gaps in their scientific thinking. They didn't, figure out that they couldn't figure out what a reason might be. So they ended up taking these desperate measures, more or less, to reveal themselves to, the Enterprise and the humans and Federation, and said, well, we're just going to, take your children, and we're powerful enough, as they demonstrated during the episode, that, you know, you don't have a choice. You're going to have to accept this. And that just as a quick comment, this is where Jean-Luc Picard shows his diplomatic skills.
Oh yeah.
Not just the good diplomatic skills, but the sophisticated, deceitful ones, which is part of diplomacy.
The deceptive ones. Yeah.
Yes.
He uses his diplomatic skills to deceive the Aldeans so he can rescue the children.
Right.
And he does so masterfully.
He does, exactly.
Times.
That was a word I was looking for.
Getting them to just constantly remain at the table. So, on one hand, they can constantly try to negotiate with the Aldeans, while on the other hand, both Beverly Crusher and Wesley kind of coordinate a little shadow intel operation behind everyone's backs.
Kind of like what the North Vietnamese did the United States back in 1972. Anyway,
on that aside, so getting back into this question of like how the Aldeans lose this knowledge and then also over relying on the custodian. So like I said, I read a good bit about AI, and there's a philosophical theory out there about, okay, if we had an AGI, an artificial general intelligence, and it really was as powerful and as scary as we think it is, or as it's projected to be, two things could happen to us. And, this is just a theory. There's no evidence behind this. It's speculation, purely speculation. But a lot of AI currently is a lot of speculation. So there's the question of the supplicant versus the sovereign. If we were suddenly introduced to an artificial general intelligence and if we were to integrate it into our lives, would we be supplicant to it? Would the AI be running our lives and determining what's best for us? Or would it allow us to become sovereigns over our own destiny, somewhat enabling us to become gods in some way, shape, or form?
Well, just to make a quick comment to that, I mean, that gets back into Wesley's comment about how all computers require maintenance.
Exactly.
So is an AGI, is it going to be able to maintain itself, or gets into your sovereign supplicant, then it gets into, creator and created,
Mm-hmm.
is the created AGI going to still need some assistance from the creator that it is basically maybe becoming superior, could becoming superior to in order to maintain itself. So is there some sort of, interdependence, codependence between
So,
the silicon life form and the carbon-based life form here?
okay, so that's a big question, and it gets back into some other
It
sci-fi
is.
themes out there,
It
because
does.
sci-fi has really done a lot to explore these themes when it comes to artificial intelligence.
Yes.
One of the stories that I really like is the story in the video game Halo, which is about the United Nations Space Force essentially fighting against an invading alien race. And one of the key things that they've developed are AIs that basically run their ships and run their networks and basically run everything. But one of the problems that these AI face is because they're made by humans and they're fallible, they develop a redundancy where they're always computing new solutions to everything, but at some point you're just going to run into contradictions. Like some solutions are not going to work with other solutions. And basically the AI creates all these redundancies and basically runs themselves mentally into the ground. They go insane to the point where they kill themselves.
They become like the fembots in Austin Powers, sort of.
Well, a little bit like that. I also kind of look at it as the Buddhist idea of parinirvana. They meditate themselves or they think themselves into oblivion, essentially. Like,
Here's something you just said. In Halo, are the AI machines have these deficits or flaws, whatever the right term is, because they're created by humans who are flawed, so that those flaws, the human flaws, end up being somehow built into the AI,
essentially, yes.
which comes into a bigger question that I just thought of.
Well,
And
I can guess
it,
what that question is. Yeah, but go on, ask it.
well, I think it says that if God created man or humans and humans are flawed,
Yep.
does that mean that God has those flaws too?
Yes.
Was that your where you thought I was going?
Yes.
Okay.
And further, like if God created humans that are flawed, and the flawed humans create an artificial intelligence, there it's always been kind of do you know what the real fictional leap of all this is?
Go ahead.
Just assuming that the artificial general intelligence is automatically going to be superior to us. It might be superior in terms of its computational abilities and everything, but it might be worse than us in some ways. It might not be able to manage itself. Like if it was given emotions, it might handle human emotions worse than actual humans do.
Goes
If
back
you
to goes back to data
Yeah,
and lore.
essentially, yes. Like, I think there's and at the same time people have always assumed like if we have an artificial general intelligence, it's going to be used for evil and malice and for military purposes, but I've always also argued just like it depends on how you look at God. It depends on how you look at a child. It depends on how you look at AI. Much of what we are going to do with AI depends on, and this is really a anthropomorphizing it. It's really going to depend a lot on how we raise our artificial intelligences. And I say artificial intelligences because I think we're going to get to a future one day where everyone's going to have their own or there's going to be multiple, and they're really going to be like our children. They're going to be our digital children. They may not be digital gods. They may be our digital children.
I guess you could say then that the Terminator stories and Terminator movies are examples of where the AI totally runs amok.
Well, like the AI in the Terminator movies supposes that the AI comes to the determination that humans are such a detriment to their own survival that you just need to wipe out humans to like remove
Right.
this integer.
right.
And like there's just no like that's such a nihilist application of the idea of AI.
Certainly, right.
And but that's also, I think, in general, a problem when it comes to the conversation of AI as a topic. A lot of it's done with a nihilist bent. But of course, I consider myself an optimist, but I also consider myself a realist. Um, I do acknowledge that there's a lot of danger and risk with AI, but there's a lot of danger and risk with being a parent. There's a lot of danger and risk of operating highly technical machines. There's a lot of danger and risk walking out your front door. Um, just to assume that our AI is going to be a negative upon us is just assuming that all we have for us is negative potential. And I just don't think that's the case. I think it's going to be very, very difficult, though. And I think, like, what you see here with the Aldeans is that supplicant sovereign complex, where on one hand, they can't live without the custodian. The custodian provides them everything. But on the other hand, the custodian has given them this power where Radu kind of like thinks he's a god compared to the crew of the Enterprise. Like,
Mhm.
but they all kind of act godlike and above um, the actual people they're kidnapping children from.
And it's very interesting how in the story that
Because it doesn't have
change.
to be one or the other. Like there can be that dynamic where the supplicant and the sovereign interchange places with each other.
Well, and that switch very rapidly occurs at the end of the story,
Yes.
where after Dr. Crusher finds out what the cause of their inability to reproduce is, and it's explained to the Aldeans and they accept it. And also, the Aldeans seem to have forgotten about the power source related to the
Mm-hmm.
custodian, and it's an immense power source. And Radu quickly realizes how blind he's been to
Mm-hmm.
their situation, and immediately, um, when the Enterprise crew learns that the Aldeans have this inability to have children, I think they offer assistance and they said, no, we're not going to do that. We're just going to take your children and that's going to solve our problem. So at the very end, when they realize that their shield is what is causing the allowing the radiation to get in because it's affected their ozone layer, and then that they have all of this power through this custodian's power source, they quickly, it's like the blinders come off and they realize, as you saying, they've been the supplicant to the superior technology, and
Mm-hmm.
all of a sudden it just shifts so that they don't become superior right away, but their whole relationship to the technology that's supported them and allowed them to be as they've been for thousands of years immediately starts to shift. And they said, well, we need to figure out a whole new future.
Well, it gets into the question of like a tool versus a crutch.
Well, they
And
didn't even know it was a crutch.
well, that's the thing. I don't think people realize how reliant they become on technology until it starts to consume them. And that, becomes a topic we've discussed many times when it comes to social media or just, the application of us having smartphones constantly in general. We didn't really understand the impact that these were going to have in terms of our general
Yeah.
lives.
There was on Bill Maher's show on HBO past Friday had, I can't remember the gentleman's name, but he was the director of CISA,
Oh yeah.
the federal agency that really looks at cyber threats and so forth. The one that, after he said that, look, I work with all the various states and their election departments and their secretaries of state. This was the cleanest election we've ever had.
Oh
We had
right.
put up defenses to keep from the Russians or the Chinese or the Iranians or whoever from meddling with it. And after Trump was putting, the story out there, oh, the whole thing was rigged and so forth, and this guy disagreed with him, he was basically fired one evening, like at 7:05 p.m. He got a tweet that Trump said, "Well, this guy's gone."
Yeah.
And
Ben,
and
you
I
lived through some things that thankfully you weren't here for most of.
what's that?
Oh, Ben, what? Thankfully,
Oh, Ben. Oh, I'm sorry,
yeah.
Ben. Yeah.
Ben thankfully wasn't here for most of the Trump administration.
But the point is, what you bring up is the dependence. I mean, we've talked before about the effect of, electromagnetic pulse
Mm-hmm.
on our systems and so forth, whether it came from an intense solar flare or it's thought that the beginning of a nuclear war is that there would be several atmospheric air bursts just to put EMP, onto our electrical grid and communication and so on, so that it would knock down, destruct our command and control communications and so on. So, I think the whole world, we're very dependent on the internet. I think that Europeans or other countries that have become that way, South Korea, of course, their penetrance of high-speed internet and smartphones and so forth is very intense.
Even Asia.
I mean,
even
even China's kind of created their own internet, and it's very controlled what the citizen can see. Their whole surveillance state is very dependent on internet and mobile communication, their own Huawei 5G systems and so forth. So if these systems go down, like we've mentioned, we go back to the 12th century in seconds.
Oh, yeah. And the thing is, we go back to the 12th century in seconds. In a year's time, we will jump back kind of to the 19th century because, we have information and knowledge we've retained to do that. I think the problem here is that, for the Aldeans, it's all, thank God that the Enterprise shows up and, you have the crew there to kind of think around the problem, because otherwise these idiots were just going to sit there and die.
Well, before you go into that, I just want to finish up that thought is that, if you look at how dependent the world is, most of the world is on cyber technology and the internet. There really needs to be some sort of treaty, international treaty, saying that, look, we've got geopolitical differences, we've got philosophical differences or form of governments, but we really do not have to get into intense cyber warfare where we're taking down power systems or turning nuclear power plants controls off, because if we go into that direction, it could be almost as bad as nuclear war. There needs to be an understanding that there's almost some sort of mutual assured destruction there, in the same way that there's generally avoidance of bioweapons at this point.
I think that we are actually probably closer to that than we think.
Of having some agreement of that sort.
No, well, I think that we get to an agreement of that sort after, for Ben, if you're listening to this, it's 2021. You're one. So, in the last few years before you were born and as you're living now, as a 1-year-old, the U.S. has been engaged with two countries, Russia and China, in an escalating cyber warfare.
Well, actually, Iran as well.
Oh, Iran as well. Thank you. That involves a lot of...
We can't leave North Korea out.
Oh, shit, we can't leave North Korea out. You know what? There's a lot of independent organizations, too.
Yes, that's
deserve
right.
some credit for breaking into some federal departments. Okay, Ben, let me just try to explain it this way. Computers made warfare go off the battlefield with bullets and enter basically bunkers and computer rooms with bytes. And I think what's going to happen is that you're going to have. I think the US will probably do it before one of our foes does it, but you will probably have an event where one country, through a cyber attack, shuts off the power grid of another in a major way. And I think once that happens, people will either go to an escalating conflict or they'll wake up and be like, "Whoa, this got scary quick."
Well,
And then you'll have the conversation. But I don't think that we've had the initiating event to us
well, we
reaching that agreement.
we may not. And one of the
To
comments
get
of
to the
this,
League of Nations, you had to have World War One, just like for the UN, you had to have World War Two.
that's a good point. And one of the things, but on the positive side, one of the things that this guy said that used to manage CISA, I think it's the acronym, on Bill Maher last Friday,
Mm-hmm.
was that when Anthony Blinken and other American diplomats met with their Chinese counterparts in Alaska a week ago, just to, have the new Secretary of State talk to his counterparts and stay out where they were, and try to acknowledge that, yeah, we have conflicts, but we really don't want to go to war with each other. So let's talk, let's have dialogue and so forth. And one of the things that came up apparently was cyber security issues and cyber hacking issues and so forth, with which the Chinese do. And one of the things supposedly the Chinese have said, because this guy apparently really wanted to find out what Blinken and his party, what the conversation was with the Chinese. And this guy now has a consulting firm that probably has some good government contracts and so forth, said that the Chinese said, you guys, meaning the Americans, you're really the best at all of this in terms of the defense. But there wasn't a lot more detail as to what that really means.
Oh, I can kind of tell you what that means. So, like, we really do have. Okay, this is going to be simple and it's going to be complicated to explain, because it surrounds a really nebulous idea of innovation and how you look at innovation. For America, innovation really is progress. And for us, progress is being able to take an idea and expand upon it and perfect it to where what it is now is at least 100 times better than the original idea. That's a very Western viewpoint of going about producing things, where in China, they will take, let's say they have like an iPhone 13, which is about to come out. They will take that iPhone 13 and they will reverse engineer, and then they will rebuild that iPhone 13 again and again and again and again and again and again until it's perfect, until they've perfected the iPhone 13. The problem is they don't go to iPhone 14. They don't create their own iPhone 14. So their idea of progress and innovation is very different from our own. Their idea of innovation is perfection of craft. Our idea of innovation is perfection of product. It's two very, very different things.
Well,
one is you can sell, what the other is what you use.
Well, I'm hoping what he was really saying in was that because of that innovative aspect for us to go on to the next level and create something really new, is that we're, as we've discussed, we've taken we've made offensive cyber attacks. But if it's true that we've been the target of more cyber attacks from multiple parties more than anyone else, that has spurred our innovation so that our cyber defenses may actually be very strong. And the one good thing is, the fact that we are an open society. And like several months ago, they talked about how, bad these Russian hacks were and so forth. It finally came out, that
they were horrible.
They were horrible.
They were horrible.
So within the, the cyber defense community, whether it's government or private contractors and so forth, that may really spur more innovation from our side to even strengthen our cyber defenses even more. And
Well,
it might actually strengthen our cyber offensive capabilities, because if you're going to develop a defense to an offensive weapon, then you're going to understand how that offensive weapon works and say, if that's how this works, then maybe we can do one better, which gets into your point that maybe cyber conflict or cyber warfare may be inevitable because someone's going to try this shit out.
well, you know how we were just talking at the beginning of the episode that like children in the 24th century are learning calculus? I honestly think in Ben's future, he might be learning ethical hacking because that's become something within the IT field that has turned into a huge growth sector where you need people who know how to break into systems to do good things
Well,
just as much as you have people that know how to break into systems to do bad things.
and one of the thoughts I had during this conversation is how much will um, the um, number of people required to be in IT expand in future years as we become more dependent on it, which fits in with your comment that you just said about what Ben might be educated to do.
But again, like that's also nebulous in itself because AI again throws that into confusion in terms of how much will AI interplay in that.
Mm-hmm.
Will we have so here's one of the big one of the big pinpoint issues when it comes to the development of an artificial general intelligence. Its military application. There is always an assumption that the first country to get a functioning artificial general intelligence that has military application wins the war. And that's a real belief. Like whoever gets there first wins the war, whether it's Russia, China, or us. Um, I think that we've probably already gotten there, and that we probably already won the war, and it's probably one of the reasons why our cyber defense is so good. We probably have an AI in the background that we just haven't revealed uh, officially that is basically beating the shit out of all these Chinese and Russian hackers every time they try to hack into our systems. And it's probably one of the reasons why the Chinese and Russians are so successful at hacking into like our commercial and corporate companies, but have such a hard time with our governmental entities, which is why the Russian hack into I think it was several defense department.
Yeah, they got into the Pentagon. Yeah,
Yeah, that's why it was so damaging. Like
right.
they really broke in very, they
And the point is,
broke past the castle
they are
walls.
still in. They're still in too.
But
Supposedly.
that's the thing. Like this is monumentally bad. Um, you know, I think there's already probably our military probably already has an artificial general intelligence that they're using. The question now is who develops the next one that's better than that
Well,
one,
and then
and vice versa, and it keeps going back and forth like that.
because of this Russian hacking into government systems, there's been discussion that one thing the Biden administration is doing is they're coming up with some sort of re, retaliation of some sort.
Well, this is kind of dovetailing off the episode, but I'm getting into real world politics instead of Star Trek. But Donald Trump's administration left Joe Biden with very few options when it comes to dealing with our enemies now.
Mm-hmm.
Because Trump was so negligent and so hands off when it came to dealing with Russia and China, especially, we now really do have very few means of negotiating a position of power, especially when it comes to China. Um, our recent, I disagree with Biden in terms of his actions in Syria as a warning to Iran, just because I think Iran is, uh, we talked a previous episode with this deal with Israel going to UAE and Bahrain. that it really is changing the dynamics of the Middle East.
Hmm.
And one thing that changes is Iran's place too, because Iran's argument is that, oh, we're leading the charge for the faith of Islam against these infidels in Israel. But the truth is, like, the Muslim world is like, no, you're not. We're now trading with these infidels. So it really does put the Iranian position in a little bit of jeopardy too, because for the longest time their claim to legitimacy was like, we're going to go fight Israel. If anyone's going to do it, we're going to go do it. That's not necessarily the case anymore, and I think even everyone, we talk about mutually assured destruction when it comes to nuclear weapons. I think there's a mutually assured destruction that's not being spoken about when it comes to Iran and Israel, because the moment Iran attacks Israel, we're going to attack Iran and literally obliterate them in a day.
Well,
But
well,
and vice versa is if Israel is not going to attack Iran because they wouldn't do it without our support in the first place. So it's not going
well,
to happen that way.
I don't know. I mean, it depends on what the Iranians would do to Israel, because if I don't know what the scenario would be, but
At this
I
point of
could,
bombing,
I,
like,
I can see the Israelis nuking the Iranians and then saying, "Hey, we did it. You need to help us." They
yeah,
wouldn't ask permission.
I
Well,
can see that too.
get back to the episode. There was one thing, um, I wanted to, we probably wanted to talk about was uh, Wesley's use of passive resistance.
Oh yeah, so he employs Mahatma Gandhi's use of starvation to passively resist an oppressive
Hmm.
force.
Hmm.
Um, it is interesting that that Wesley has been so philosophically trained to understand the power of this technique.
Hmm.
Um, I think it says something about the 80s that this is being kind of revered in children and being used in episode. I think it also says something about Star Trek. Do you know the story behind the Vulcan nerve pinch? Like why it was
Mm,
created?
no.
So, originally they wanted Leonard Nimoy to they wanted Spock's character to get into a fight with another character in an episode, and Leonard Nimoy went to Gene Roddenberry and he's like, "Why am I punching this guy? This is the future. They had you tell me in the future they haven't figured out some way to negotiate past violence." And Gene Roddenberry's like, "Well, what do you have in mind?" He's like, Spock's like, "Well, what if the Vulcans had developed this nerve pinch where they don't actually have to harm anyone? They just pinch right here and the person falls unconscious." Um, I think in many ways that is a huge philosophical leap forward by saying we're not going to resort to violence to defend ourselves or to go and get what we want. Um, I think Wesley doing that here is continuing that tradition in Star Trek, but it's also, I don't know, how did your generation look at Gandhi in terms of because Martin Luther King really didn't use um, he used nonviolence and a philosophy of nonviolence, but he
Martin,
didn't use starvation. This was usually
no,
something that Gandhi used
no, Martin
prolifically.
Luther King, I think, as I understand it, really understood from Gandhi the passive resistance
Yes.
aspect. And I don't know how well Americans in general, at least I speak for myself, understood um, how a lot of the civil rights protests during the 60s were based on passive resistance from Gandhi's example. It wasn't until really that the movie Gandhi came out, and which was a very popular movie, and I think a
Mm-hmm.
lot of people saw that movie and have seen it since then, since it's
Starring
on
Ben Kingsley.
Netflix or whatever. Yeah, Ben Kingsley, and they understood the whole history of Gandhi, and there's the one real scene where um, they're protests and all of these Hindu men are lined up, and they have the British officers have a number of, Indian soldiers lined up with, batons.
Mm-hmm.
And these guys go up to try to go, protest something, and they're all struck down.
Mm-hmm.
And there are, nurses there to take care of them, to, bandage their bloody heads and, so forth. And, the reporters are there reporting on it. And, that scene and that history is similar to, fire hoses and barking German shepherds in Birmingham and in Selma in 1964, 1965. So I think, there were people that, sort of understood, would have understood in the late 1980s what passive resistance meant, more from having an understanding of the civil rights movement than Gandhi.
Mm-hmm. That's an interesting take, because growing up, we were actually in middle school. We actually learned a lot about Gandhi and the Indian independence movement, and in his quest to break away from the British Raj. Uh, we actually learned a lot about how he used homespun as a way to break away from the British economic power.
In junior high school and high school, my experience, there was no mention of
See,
British
fascinating.
independence. Yeah,
See,
none.
because in middle school, we learned about MLK as much as we learned about Gandhi. So it's just interesting to see how, talking about education in this episode, my education progressed in some ways from your education in terms of just how we dealt with some figures in history.
I mean, it's interesting you bring that up, because I remember in 8th grade, um, which was I was at a junior high school in Baltimore City, which was very interesting because it was 2/3 white, 1/3 black. So it was the first time I'd had that exposure to, integrated education. And the only social history we had, I remember it was in geography, that our teacher lectured us on the history of Russia. And it was all just wrote that Ivan the Fourth and then Peter the Great and up to the Communist Revolution. But it was just all this memorization of rote facts and so forth, but like no explanation of why are we learning this, other than, are you teaching us about our enemy? But
Well,
they didn't teach us anything about Marxism, socialism, or anything like that.
yeah.
The only time I had any socially conscious um, education was in my senior year of, it was called Contemporary Issues Social Studies. And the teacher I had was an attorney, a
Oh,
Jewish attorney. And he ended up being a judge. I'll say his name. His name was Arnold Jablon. He was a very smart guy. And he brought social issues related to racism and things like that right into the classroom. And that was all I had.
yeah. See, like, that's just fascinating because, the idea of not growing up, every history class that I had growing up, at least when it dealt with U.S. history, talked about the civil rights movement and Martin Luther King Jr. and at least Malcolm X. We didn't learn anything about like the Nation of Islam or Louis Farrakhan, and we didn't learn anything about Fred Hampton or like the Black Panther movement. And we certainly didn't learn anything about the FBI. Um, I think it's fascinating that one thing that we notice here in terms of just educational progress has a real feature of expanding the story. Like, I think when we have a better education system, it's more children walk away with a much wider worldview because they've taken in many more stories and viewpoints than the previous generation before them. And I think that's a real benefit. I think one of the things that may be a problem the Aldeans aren't noticing, and it may be one of the reasons they end up in their situation, is that they don't have any viewpoints outside themselves. Everything is casted in the Aldean gaze as already being superior.
Yeah, when they put up their planetary cloaking system, it's like they close themselves off from everything.
Well, it's funny that they even keep using the planetary cloaking system because they have an
Yes,
extremely powerful weapon in this repulsor beam
yes, that's a good point. Right.
that apparently can like throw ships so far that it would take decades for
Hmm.
them to reach Aldea again.
They could have made the Enterprise Voyager.
Exactly. Well, like one thing that they offer Picard when he comes down to negotiate for the children's release is that if we keep the children, we'll give you access to technological innovations that you've never thought of before, and we never really get into like what those are really. But it makes me wonder a little bit about the world building of Star Trek because we see a lot of new things every series kind of introduced.
Mhm.
New ship designs, new ways of new weapons, new teleportation devices, a bunch of new stuff. But we're never really given an explanation of like where this originated or who designed this or where did this idea come from. It seems to me if the Aldeans are really this powerful and this really technologically advanced, if it would just seem like by the time we get to a series like Voyager, um, we would see the effects of that technology taking place. Especially like I don't know. I think we keep talking about the sculpting tool that they give Harry, that basically takes whatever he sees in his mind and transposes it onto the wood. That's a pretty amazing piece of technology that I'm surprised hasn't been employed or at least kind of taken and I guess applied elsewhere. It's just an interesting factor about the Star Trek universe that the progress of technology itself sometimes seems very slow, but at the same time, like we've seen in previous episodes that they're using ships that seem designed 80 years beforehand during Kirk's later era too.
Mhm.
So
Mhm.
it just makes me wonder about what is the actual progress of technology within the
Yeah, I
world
just I
itself.
just look at one of my notes is that one of the things that Outdance did was they violated the prime directive in a reverse direction,
Yes.
which gives brings up the point is that if an alien race, in this case the Federation, or let's just as you just said, the Aldans claim that they have technology far beyond what the Federation has. If you establish um, you know communication and start to work with people, do you have a responsibility? What responsibility do you have to share technology with, another
Hmm.
party that would benefit them? It goes back to first first contact and the Vulcan idea of prime directive that they weren't, again, the Vulcans would not visit another world until it was work capable. So
Hmm.
that's sort of where the prime directive for the Federation came from, the roots of it. But from Enterprise series with Jonathan Archer, one of the points of contention throughout that series, particularly in the first several seasons, is how the Vulcans thought that humans were not ready to go out into interstellar space and
Hmm.
they didn't share information and so on. So, and at the same, I don't know if,
But
but
it is later revealed through Saval when he's talking to I forget the general's name or the head of Starfleet's name, Admiral,
Forrester,
yeah, Admiral Forrester. They're at Starfleet. They're at United Earth Command,
mm-hmm,
and Saval basically says like we had our wars, but it took us 1,000 years for us to reach the stars again.
Mm.
You guys did it in
Oh, that's right. I remember that
a
quote.
few
And
centuries, and it basically reveals that the Vulcans are not don't think the humans are ready. They're scared of
they're
how
scared of us. Yes, right,
quickly they're truly scared of how quickly we might progress ahead of them.
right.
Um, so I always took that scene to be kind of the real revelation of what the Vulcans really felt about us. They're actually kind of in awe. They're in deep kind of like existential awe and in some ways terror of us. Because it gets in the joke like uh, if you need a human to fix something in Star Trek, what do? Well, you call someone, they'll say, "Well, hold my beer," and they'll just figure out something. Well, and the Vulcans will sit back and go, "Well, how the hell did they do that?" Um, but getting to the question of like sharing technology, I think I think in some cases, once certain things happen in the Star Trek universe, it would have to become kind of a prerequisite to make the Federation work. Like, for example, once the Borg enter the the storylines, especially once you have something like First Contact where they almost make it to Earth, I think that you would have to spread anti-Borg technology to your allies and the Klingons, but also like your rivals in the Romulans, because if the Romulans are taken over by the Borg and the Borg are able to assimilate their technology, who knows what the Romulans have been working on against the Federation?
Oh, it's the old in what was it? Not Armageddon, Independence Day in 1997 or 98, whatever,
Yeah,
that movie came out. And, you
great
know,
film.
it's, the point where the, you know, um, Goldberg figures out, Jeff Goldblum, whatever his character was, figures out how to take down uh, the protective shield from the ships and so forth. They figure out how they need to fly up to the mothership and all of that, and how they're going to communicate that to the other air forces around the world. And they say, "Oh, we'll do it by Morse code." And they start sending the messages out, and the Israelis and Arabs are out in the Sinai Desert, and and they said, "We're getting a message from about how to take them down from the Americans." And the Brit says, "It's about time they figured it out." It's like, well, who else was going to figure it out but us? Of course, it's an American-made movie, but the point is that if you have something beneficial like that, you have a responsibility to share it. It comes into, I think if we ever do figure out how to do fusion,
Oh yeah.
somebody will license it, and then it should be licensed to the Chinese and the Russians and the Indians and everybody,
Oh, the
because
BRICS nations first. Yeah.
it would be, it would totally answer the green revolution, the climate change. I mean, I'm even, I since I do some work for a company in the UK, and I look every morning at a e-newsletter from the Engineer, which is the British Engineering Society. They are very much into, and I think probably the technology is being developed here of much smaller, safer nuclear reactors.
Oh yeah.
Because I believe that, yeah, nuclear reactors are concerned. The waste is concerned. But if you really wanted to have, the issue of the variation in power generation from solar and wind, um, you need something stable. So you have either coal or nuclear or gas turbines. And of course, the coal and gas turbines run off fossil fuels. So if you want to replace them, the thing to do would be to amp up the amount of nuclear energy electricity we generate.
So I actually have a friend who's a nuclear engineer down in Texas. He opened up his own brewery in Brownsville. Um,
What are some of the names of his brews?
oh God, I have to look it up.
Yeah,
I think it's called Brownsville Brewing Company.
I'm just thinking whether it has anything to do with nuclear radiation. But anyway, that's just
No, but he was talking about he's worked in nuclear reactor development, and a lot of these newer smaller reactors don't have the issue of waste anymore. a lot of the nuclear waste that we're dealing with is a lot of it's from these outdated reactors that are still functioning because you really don't know how to turn them off. Like the
Hmm.
one in Fukushima that was damaged during it was a tsunami that hit it, right?
It was an earthquake, and then the tsunami did the damage. Yeah.
Right. There was a earthquake generated tsunami, but that the one in Fukushima was relatively outdated in terms of technology, which is why it had such a catastrophic failure versus the new ones that are being built here in America and also all around the world that have so many fail-safe devices and they're really safe and they're really carbon neutral and
See, that's the thing here.
they're
I don't think any new nuke plants are being built even now.
I think there's one or two.
Maybe one or two, but there ought to be more,
But
really.
I think the problem is you still have, and it kind of gets into any conversation we have. Do you know what the Overton window is? So the Overton window is this philosophical view of here's this window, and everything in this window are all the things that are um, permissible to talk about in mainstream politics.
Hmm.
Like for example, it's okay for us to talk about um, it's permissible for us to talk about punching Nazis,
Hmm.
but it's not permissible for us to talk about promoting Nazis. They are outside the Overton window. But inside the Overton window, punching Nazis is something that can exist in the mainstream media as something good to talk about. Do you understand what I'm saying now?
Yes, and there's a funny corollary that you can't punch Belgians anyway.
Yeah.
Right.
Um, but nuclear energy may still um, exist outside our Overton window when it comes
I
to
see.
discussion
Yeah.
about energy,
Right.
which is
Right.
unfortunate because
It is.
we've moved the window, and I've been thinking about the Overton window a lot because of how our politics have moved.
Hmm.
But in terms of talking about energy, the idea that wind and when I was growing up, the idea of wind and solar was still being laughed at. So the Overton window has moved so much that now wind and solar is seen as kind of prerequisites for us going forward in terms of an energy um, soluble solution. But nuclear is a big part of that too. That won't be able to be left out because we really do need stable energy. And if you can make a cold fusion reactor, uh, it's not a question of if we figure out interstellar travel. It's a question of when we figure out
Right.
interstellar travel. Because at that point, not only do we have a device that can create clean energy that's powerful that we can use to fuel things almost indefinitely. Um, it now just becomes a question of scaling that energy up to fuel certain things and certain processes.
Just on a related note, since Biden's now starting to put together this next infrastructure spend, one of the things that's announced is they really want to expand the number of
Mm-hmm.
electrical generating fields using wind turbines off the U.S. East Coast.
Yeah, and the new turbine designs are amazing.
I don't know about that. I'll have to look that up.
Oh yeah, the new wind turbine designs are based on a cylindrical design.
Oh,
So
okay.
there's no actual blades anymore. What it does is
Huh.
that the wind
Oh,
passes through the
sure.
cylinder and it spins the
Oh,
cylinder.
I've seen some of those. They have windmills like that for running uh,
Yeah,
irrigation pumps and so on.
you can
Yeah,
scale those up to fuel cities now.
sure. Yeah.
The the leaps that we're going to be taking in terms of green innovation when it comes to wind and solar, like California just got solar. I know Bill Maher was celebrating that.
Yes, right. Yeah.
But really, once we do that, um, a lot of things fundamentally change. But at the same time, some of the things that we've come to take for granted as just things that we have to deal with will disappear too. Like
Well,
power companies, power distribution companies, that will probably be
in
a public utility and not a private sector anymore.
an interesting note is that during the pandemic, sometimes I'll just get in the car, which is putting CO2 into the atmosphere at this point, and will drive, out to just explore a new area in Wake County or Chatham County or Hardin County and so forth. And you drive out to the country and you will just stumble on, some solar panel fields that are like 10, 20 acres in size.
Mm-hmm.
I mean, they're out there, and North Carolina's done very well in solar energy.
Every single state and city can employ this along with wind energy and completely do away with the need for coal or
And
even
speaking
hydroelectric, which has a lot of waste to it as well.
speaking of generating electricity, I saw a note today that there's this rumor that Volkswagen of America might change its name to Volkswagen,
Oh, haha.
since they've decided to go totally electric by like 2035, 2040, just like GM.
Well, I think the question becomes, and it's always been the issue, in terms of discussing energy and the marketplace. It's always going to become an issue of capacity, like how far the battery can really take you, and then the cost of production versus the final MSRP. So, it'll be one thing if they can produce a battery that can take you 500 miles on a charge.
That's going to be key. Sure. Yeah.
But it also needs to be able to be produced at a price that, there was something really, really revolutionary that Elon Musk is doing by putting out, I think it's the Tesla Model 10. It's a $35,000 sedan. And that's still expensive. Like $35,000 is a lot for a car. But if they were able to get that down to the price of like a Toyota Corolla, like 13 grand, that really does change the entire car market to where a lot of people that can afford to buy their first new vehicle or buying their first starter vehicle will be able to afford electric. I think the real goal is to get it down even cheaper than that, to where electric cars should be even cheaper than.
That's going to have to happen. And just think if we're successful in
petroleum needs to become a premium product in a way.
Well, and if we're successful like GM and Tesla and Volkswagen, whoever, they expand, the availability of electric vehicles, they become less expensive, charging stations, charging technology, that network is better established and so forth. And that's occurring. I mean, it's a tremendous market to replace all of the gas dependent vehicles, internal combustion, with electric vehicles.
Well, I think one thing that people misunderstand about how the economy changes when the electric vehicle actually takes hold is that you don't actually see just the outright disappearance of
No,
petrol.
it wouldn't be snapping the fingers. Correct. Yeah.
Well, like there's going to be a collector's market for petrol engines and petrol cars. There will be racing still that will be run off petrol, including electric racing. If anything, having a petrol car and owning a petrol car will become very much a luxury item that you have to be able to afford, to a certain extent, and will require a certain amount of income that a lot of people will probably look at and decide not to go with in lieu of a cheaper, more cost-effective, and maybe equally performing electric car.
Well, I think that I don't know if there's anything
Which
else.
is what we should want in the future,
Yeah.
by the way.
I don't know if there's anything else in the episode we need to cover, but actually this last part of the discussion fits really well in with the end because one of the discoveries was, hey, you've got this custodian that you depended on, but you'd forgotten that there's this tremendous power source that you have not developed, and that technology you might want to share with us sometime. So, that's a big, future possibility from Aldea that, could have been explored in another story or something like that.
Well, let's explore Picard's last line,
Yes.
which is kind of the crux of the show.
Yeah.
when the Aldeans lose the ability to cloak their planet, they're now kind of bare to the entire universe. The Aldeans are no longer legends.
Mhm.
So Picard makes the illusion like, well, the legend will die, but the people will live. And I think that that's such an important line for this episode
It
because
is.
it applies so much to what's happening right now and what we're dealing with today. Um, you know, Ben, if you're listening to this, growing up, your granddaddy, my father, well, your pop, my dad, Jake, who's hosting the show with me. um, we were raised on legends about our own country, about how we were to view our nationalism, how we were to view our identities as citizens and participants in a democracy. And what has happened is that these stories were told so many times and taken at such face value that we lost the truth behind them. And in some cases, the truth carried some very dark and harmful aspects that affected and affected the destinies of millions and millions of people for hundreds of years. This gets back to the original sin of the United States of America. Your grandfather and I were discussing the last episode, the original sin of slavery. But the important thing about the legends dying, but the people getting to live, as it applies to the Aldeans, and then as it applies to our real world, is that you're going to grow up with all these stories, Ben, that people will tell you are ironclad and resolute, and that these stories are so important that if we don't have them, somehow life won't go on. The truth is that some of these stories hold us back and they keep us from reaching our best potential. And sometimes these stories have a way of teaching us or causing us to treat others less than we should. The important lesson is that when you discover a story or a legend that causes you to treat people less than they should or causes you not to reach your full potential, you really need to look at whether or not that story serves you in any real way that's beneficial to you, to the people around you that you love, and to your community in general. The Aldeans have to give up the legend of being this mysterious world that can hide themselves so they can keep surviving and have children and have a future. In many ways, America, for it to have a future, is going to reckon with its own legends and reckon with the truth of those legends for us to go forward and create new stories that are better, more inclusive, and allow people more opportunity to not only see themselves, but to see others who are not like them achieve the same thing and help us all realize how human we are, within ourselves and to each other. Um, Dad, would you like to add anything to that? I know
No, I
I.
could. I think it was very elegantly put, actually. Um, as you said, the
Well,
point was with the Aldeans, the Enterprise had already taken some steps to reseed their ozone so that their bodies could repair themselves and they could ultimately create and have children. So
oh,
they're,
and Beverly
the
provided them a medication,
yeah.
some sort of therapy.
So their race could continue. But I think what you said in terms of what has happened, particularly in the last year, and a lot of it. I mean, it's interesting because today the George Floyd trial started
Yeah,
in Minnesota, and that is a
over
very
the fate of Derek Chauvin,
right, and that's a very
who
specific
murdered George Floyd.
right,
Yeah,
and but that is a strong example of how the attitudes of the past that have not been resolved and still exist need to be addressed. And you could call it a legend, you could call it um, you know, a social theme, a social meme that, has gone on for years and hasn't been right in terms of acceptance of inequality, of, suspicion of the other, all the anti-Asian
Well,
events that are going on now.
let,
So
let me let me explain it home to Ben real quick what
yeah,
we're
go
talking
ahead.
about. So, just a quick aside, Ben. There was a man named George Floyd, who's a black man here in America, who was stopped by police. I think they were in Ohio.
No, they were in Minneapolis, Minnesota.
Right, they were in Minneapolis. Thank you. He was stopped by police, and during that stop, the police forced him to the ground, and one of the police, by the name of Derek Chauvin, placed his knee on the back of Mr. Floyd's neck, and Mr. Floyd suffocated and choked to death. During this, he begged the officer to not hurt him, and the officer didn't pay attention, and
Because he said he could not breathe.
because he could not breathe. And the officer did not pay attention to that, and unfortunately, Mr. Floyd died. Um, as we're recording this, the trial of that police officer is now underway. Um, I agree, Dad, what you're saying about the legends, because one of them is, um, growing up, and this is something I think is a particularly white thing, but growing up with the legend and the cultural conditioning that you can trust police, in many ways, is one of those stories that we're having to deal with now. You know, for a lot of people of a certain economic and racial background, we've never had to look at the police as anything threatening or oppressive or part of a system that is meant to keep us down in some ways. But for many people in many communities, especially people that aren't white, um, for them, the story has always been dealing with an oppressive force that has not treated them equitably or equally according to the laws of this land. I think dealing with that has been dealing with the legend of being able to trust the police versus the reality of what we see every day now is a prime example of having to let the legend go so ultimately people can live. We have to deal with abusive policing, we have to deal with white supremacy, and we have to deal with people holding bad opinions and bad beliefs about others, and ultimately those beliefs and opinions spurning bad actions against others based on the wrong idea, and it is a wrong idea that someone's race is a determining factor whether they are good or not. Um, to do that, you have to address these legends, and you have to dig through these legends, and sometimes you have to do away with these legends to find the truth. And by finding that truth, you allow people the chance to find happiness, essentially.
Mm-hmm.
Um, Dad, I'm sorry if I'm ranting.
No.
Would you
That's
like to say?
that's well put, because it fits into, what was said in the Declaration of Independence: pursuit of what? Life, liberty, and the pursuit of happiness.
Absolutely. Essentially, at the end of this, what hopefully comes out of the trial of Derek Chauvin is that no matter who you are, the police in this country should treat you equitably, and fairly. And you shouldn't. It doesn't matter if you're white, black, a man or a woman, gay, straight, bi, trans, or queer. You shouldn't have to worry about walking down the street and seeing the police and being worried about your own life, whoever you are. That is not something that should happen here in America at all. We should be able to look, everyone in this country, every citizen of every walk of life should be able to look at the law enforcement officers in their community and not feel an iota of fear. That's where we should be. That's kind of what's guaranteed in the Constitution by life, liberty, and the pursuit of happiness. You're able to pursue life knowing that you don't have to worry about criminals coming and getting you, because the people protecting you from the criminals are actually out there protecting you. They're not criminals themselves. Um, so let's wrap up here. So just to recap, you know, I really enjoyed this episode. I think while it's a little bit of a, I feel like it's a little bit more of a topical episode. It hasn't been as deep as some of the
Yeah,
others.
right.
It is still a very good episode in terms of how well the narrative is constructed. Do you have any final thoughts or feelings on this
Um,
episode, Dad? Or
no, I agree with what you just said. Is that it's again, it's a good story. It doesn't have broad focus, but once you identify what some of the key points are, it really can catalyze some very, very good thoughts.
absolutely. So on that, we will end this episode of Where No Bubs Has Gone Before tonight. Join us next time for Star Trek Season 1, Episode 18, Home Soil, which I'm actually looking very forward to because we are going to be getting into the definition of life outside of the one we're used to.
Yes,
But
right.
on that, Dad, thank you for joining me and have
Thank
a
you,
good
Jay. It
night.
was good. All right. Bye bye now.